Randy, welcome to the show. Thank you for making the time.
Thanks so much for having me, Elena.
So you and I met at a conference, a local conference in Arlington, Virginia, and you told me this concept that I've never heard of before, which is around depolarizing organizational cultures. So I want to start with that because I think it's super fascinating, brief things that you told me about it. So I want you to define, like, what does it mean? And then also share some insights of how you actually help organizations do that.
Yeah, so interesting that you should ask for a definition because my organization is called Depolarizing Organizational Cultures, and it can actually be taken a couple different ways. So first of all, there are definitely some organizations that are having internal strife based on some of the cultural issues that are happening right now in society, the polarization, the political division that we're experiencing. And so those organizations could use some help in terms of allowing people to exchange their ideas more freely and with less divisiveness, with less anger between them, and more understanding, more curiosity. But it's actually also you can really view it as building depolarizing cultures inherently themselves, right? So depolarizing can be a verb when you're actually working with a culture to work on issues that they already have. Or depolarizing can be an adjective that describes the kind of culture that has a positive impact on all of the people within it and all of the people who that organization touches and all the other organizations that it's related to. So we want to help organizations, even if they're not already experiencing this kind of strife, to build the kind of culture that is welcoming to a variety of viewpoints and that makes sure that people aren't stifling their true beliefs, and which also has impact on how they interact in terms of business ideas or the goals of the organization that maybe aren't even related to political issues or public policy, right? When that kind of strife sets in and some people feel like they're not part of the organizational culture, they're outside of the culture of that organization, they start to shut down. They stop sharing their ideas freely amongst each other. And that's not really healthy for an organizational culture, whether it's business or whether it's nonprofits, religious organizations, educational institutions. All of these types of organizations really need their members to feel like they can freely exchange their ideas without feeling that their colleagues are going to jump on them for not hewing to the orthodoxy of the organization.
And do you see this as something that's gotten kind of more challenge, like that's a bigger challenge for companies, especially post-COVID? Because I feel like that was such a political dividing, culturally speaking, especially, like, because the companies were, there's a lot that happened there, but companies started requiring like vaccinations, and of course everybody related it to politics, and then like a lot of other kind of belief systems and values. So do you feel it gotten worse since then, or has it always been a challenge for organizations?
Well, I do think that it's gotten worse. And there's a couple interesting trends that we can look to figure out why. So in recent years, especially I think since the 2016 election, these issues have been readily apparent to us on a society level, right? But that election was not just the catalyst of these trends. It was a result of decades of what's been going on in our political system, in our in cultural trends. And one of the really important issues that's going on is sorting. So back to Bowling Alone and the Big Sort from a few decades ago, these social science books that talked about how we are sorting ourselves geographically, right? And I was actually just reading a really interesting article about college towns and how they're getting so much more blue these days, and other, more rural areas are getting more staunchly conservative. And so we are sorting ourselves such that our shared spaces, especially physical spaces, are kind of going away. We're no longer encountering people who believe differently from us in everyday life. And actually, we still do have some shared spaces. Some people feel that we're sorting ourselves digitally as well, that we're spending time in digital echo chambers. And that's actually less true than most people believe. But the fact is, those digital spaces that we share have really toxic incentives. They incentivize us to really express our anger, to make sure that we are showing our loyalty to our political groups. And when that happens, it gets really amped up and we feed off of one another. And of course, the phrase culture wars is really, has become really prominent in our current times. And what's happening is, each side is building its affective polarization, which means that we feel that not only is the other side wrong about public policy, but they're actively trying to harm the country, and they have moral failings, and they're not morally upright enough for us to engage with in a political sense. So we just don't have time for one another anymore. And so, of course, during the pandemic, a lot of people reevaluated their priorities in life. I certainly did. And I actually moved from the West Coast, California, to DC about 4 months ago. And I'm now very close to my brother and his family. And I'm also a lot closer to my parents, my cousins, my aunt and uncle. And so family is really important to a lot of people. And especially in times of remote work, people are deciding to live where they want rather than where their job has brought them, right? But as we continue to be more mobile in terms of where we are deciding to live, we are sorting ourselves more and more and saying, okay, well, if I'm moving, I might as well move to a place that has a lot of people who agree with me, right? So we are really reinforcing our existing biases by surrounding ourselves with people who just agree with us, and only encountering people who we disagree with when there is just an absolutely toxic environment that is going to make those interactions reinforce our beliefs about the other side, that they're the absolute worst and that they have no good ideas to contribute. So yeah, I think that the pandemic certainly kind of supercharged those trends. It also has affected younger generations who are going through their educational experiences during that time. And a lot of them were just purely online experiences where it's a lot more difficult to build those personal relationships, right? And so, yeah, I think we're suffering in a lot of different ways that is creating these issues and these dynamics that we're experiencing now.
Yeah, and I think just as humans, we have this tendency to be part of a group. So it's like it's a tribal mentality, right? Like that's like if we take it way back, like we almost want to be part of something. And I think it's natural for humans to be like, I want to be a part of something. And then it's like us versus them. And I feel like it's always been that struggle.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I know your work is mainly within the US, but I'm just curious, do you see this happening, if you know about it, but do you see this happening in other countries? Is it primarily like a US very much because we have that system here, or is it beyond the US borders? Is it just like as a company, we all experience these different things, or is it primarily American problem?
Yeah, I mean, these issues are happening around the world. There was definitely, we've seen division in so many countries around the world where, far left and far right political parties are popping up, and they are, at each other's throats more and more. You see authoritarianism popping up in a lot of countries. I think in the US, one of the things that is interesting about us is we're ahead of the curve in certain trends. And so I think social media and the impact that's had on our society is kind of more advanced here than it is in other countries. I just saw an interesting poll that said the US is leading in terms of the negative belief about how social media has impacted society. So we're one of the only countries in the world that believes that social media has been a net negative for our lives, right? And I remember, 15, 20 years ago when the internet was first developing, and we were so excited about the potential of this to link all of us and to help us understand one another's stories and, open us up to different cultures and really just expand our world. And I think that a lot of people in the US, especially because of these negative incentives, have seen almost the opposite happen, right? It has expanded our world in a lot of ways, but it's also narrowed the influences that are coming to us because of algorithmic trending, right? So we're constantly being shown things that are easy to monetize because they agree with us and because they ramp up our anger. And anger is very shareable, right? And so we are really leading that curve in terms of the negative impact that social media is having upon our mental health. We see this manifested in so many different ways, but especially young people are really suffering from this. And so I do think that it is happening in other places around the world, but we're ahead of the curve in certain dynamics of that. And so I think that other countries are likely to start experiencing that a little bit more in the way that we have.
And, I imagine, as I'm thinking of like organizations that I've worked with, I'm like, I wonder if they're even aware of this problem. Like, do you run into it? Like, is it very obvious for leaders and organizations, or is it typically housed under another problem? I'm just curious, and maybe they are very aware, but.
Yeah, I mean, so I think organizational leaders do have a sense of this, but it is really uncomfortable to talk about this sort of friction within your organization. I've talked to journalists who have been trying to get, this sort of story, and a lot of organizational leaders are reluctant to talk openly about the conflicts that they are experiencing within their organizations. There was an interesting study that Business for America and the Civic Health Project collaborated on last year. It was called Business Bridging Divides. And they talked to about 24 leaders in business, and most of them said that they were experiencing some friction. And about half of them actually said that the leaders of their organizations were really struggling to respond to this divisiveness without being actually further divisive, right? And making things worse. And we definitely see some conflicts around diversity, equity, inclusion training, right? So some of those programs have those programs have a variety of ways that they approach their goals, and some of them take approaches that may not be the best for engaging some of the folks that they'd really like to target. And so they are taking approaches that often say, if you aren't part of a disadvantaged group, a group that has been victimized in some way, that your perspective in part of this conversation is really not valued as much as others. And so what that's doing is making people check out of the conversation. And especially those on the right, I think that conservatives, many of them have felt like their place within those programs, and by extension within the organizations that are running those programs, are really not valued. And so they are disengaging with those programs, and it's often making situations within those organizations worse, right? And so I think that leaders are struggling with that issue, but again, they don't really want to be very public about those struggles. And so I think it's boiling under the surface a little bit. But ultimately, I do think that there is a reckoning that's going to be happening as organizations continue to kind of filter out those who don't identify with their primary political culture, if you will. And they're becoming a bit more monoculture, right? So, and when that happens, you have an impact on innovation, you have an impact on retention. And so there is definitely information that points to the negative business outcomes for businesses that are not paying attention to this stuff, and also negative outcomes for other organizations like nonprofits and religious communities.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I'm like, okay, what's the cost if they don't address it? And you're correct, because studies have been done, numerous studies, that diversity and that kind of that sharing of ideas, the psychological safety, is what drives innovation, as you mentioned, and what drives collaboration. And that's how in today's day and age, where it's so competitive, you need that kind of talent on board, right? And to be able to attract the right kind of talent as well. So just coming from a talent development perspective, I can see how it impacts recruitment strategies, growth of the business, individual growth, all that stuff. So it's definitely a challenge that needs to be addressed. But yeah, I can see how people might not want to be public about it.
Right. And also, I mean, not only are they impacting their ability to recruit from across the political spectrum, but they are restricting the markets that they can actually market to, right? So these days, a lot of consumers are demanding that the companies that they do business with, the companies that they buy from, are more public about their values. And so a lot of companies are feeling like trapped in between these worlds. And when they restrict the folks that they're bringing into their organization, they restrict also who they're able to speak to outside the organization, right? So if you have a diverse customer base, you really have to have people within the organization that can speak to that customer base, right? Especially if you are a very public-facing organization. Some of the organizations, some of the businesses that I have talked to about these challenges, what is so challenging is when there is a headquarters, often that's located in a fairly blue urban area, and then their retail network, which can be nationwide, right? And you run into conflicts between the values that are espoused at the HQ level, and then the values that have to play out across the retail network, where the rubber meets the road, and you're actually in communities that have their own values and want to see those reflected in the stores and the other retail operations that are going on within their communities, right? So and certainly it's really important to be able to support your employees in those areas and stand up for their rights, right? Which I think a lot of corporations and other large companies are trying to do, right? But at the same time, if you do that in a way that alienates that community, that does tend to even put your employees at further risk, right? A further risk from alienation from those communities. We've even seen violence in some of these these retail outlets. So yeah, these are really concerning trends, and organizations definitely have to be focused on who they're attracting internally, but who they can speak to externally as well.
Before speaking with you, I never really thought about it from that perspective. So I think that you have a very unique kind of twist on organizational culture, and you see it from a different lens, which completely makes sense. But I'm curious, how did you get in? Like, what made you like recognize, like, okay, this is happening? Like, what's the background story of you as a professional? I'm curious.
Yeah, sure. So I worked in the auto industry for about 15 years before I came to work on political depolarization. I'd always loved cars, and I really considered myself lucky to be able to talk about them every day. But eventually within that career, I didn't really feel like I was contributing a lot to the world. I was getting a bit alienated from it. I actually went through a layoff from my last automotive job. And at the same time, I really found myself curious about perspectives very different from my own during the 2016 election, especially, right? And so I said, we really can have these conversations with one another, but we need the tools, we need the motivation, because often it does take some courage to engage in these conversations, especially when our relationships might be at risk when we do that, right? But if we stop talking about what we believe so deeply, then our marketplace of ideas, which is really essential to the functioning of our democracy, is at stake, right? And so I thought about starting my own nonprofit, but I didn't at that point have any experience in the nonprofit world, the connections that one might need. But I was writing about these ideas, and one of the friends who I shared this writing with showed me a podcast that an organization that was then called Better Angels was featured on. And I said, wow, they're doing exactly what I would like to do. And so I decided to join that organization. They've since changed their name to Braver Angels, and that reflects the courage that is needed for these sorts of conversations. And I got trained in late 2017 as a moderator within that organization. And I started to run workshops that would teach people communication skills and also bring groups of reds and blues, as we call them, together to exchange their perspectives and really to understand whether their image of folks on the other side of the political divide was actually accurate, right? And one of the first rules in those red-blue workshops is that nobody is there to change anybody else's mind. And that was really a revelation to me, right? It was about understanding one another more deeply, finding the common ground where it exists, because we tend to underestimate how much common ground does exist. And so at the end of pretty much every red-blue workshop that I ran, someone would say, man, we are so much closer than I had realized. And that was genuinely inspiring to me. But I do remember this one moment where it reinforced that this is really what I needed to do with my life. And I was running a skills workshop that it was just basic communication skills. Braver Angels now calls it skills for bridging the divide. And, you know, I was talking to a woman who had described some tension in her relationship with her sister. And, you know, she asked a question about one of these skills, and I gave a deeper explanation. And I just saw this light go on in her eyes, and this weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. And she was given renewed hope about that relationship, and that it could be strengthened, and they could work through some of those frictions that they had been experiencing. And once that happened, I realized how much of a positive impact that this work can have on so many people, not only in their work lives, in their personal lives, in their civic lives, right? And that was just so amazingly rewarding. So I decided, okay, I'm all in with the depolarization work. In 2019, I started pushing things forward in California, where I lived. And then in 2020, I stepped in to lead the pivot from in-person workshops to online workshops, of course, when we all of a sudden needed those in spades. So, and I also, after that, started working with a lot of different partners. And so I said that, you know, many organizations are experiencing these frictions as the profile, the awareness of Braver Angels started to rise around the country. These organizations were coming to us and saying, hey, we need some help, right? And so that's when I really started to appreciate the place that organizations have in fighting polarization in this country. And it really goes back to those shared spaces that are disappearing, right? Organizations in general, because they have shared goals, but they don't necessarily, they haven't always brought together people with the same political perspectives, right? So with those shared goals, they reinforce those relationships, and people get to know each other outside of their politics before those political conversations come up. And then they come to appreciate one another as, you know, friends, colleagues, fellow Americans who actually want good things for this country, right? And so once they realize that, they can engage in really difficult conversations about public policy and about politics and, you know, the culture wars and things like that, with more good faith, with understanding that, all right, I know you as a person, and I know that you want the best for me and for everyone around us, right? And so it becomes so much easier to engage in conversations that are this hard, right?
You know what I find fascinating is that as we, you know, develop as a human race, communication is still the biggest challenge we have, right? Even though we get so intelligent and we, you know, we're so smart and all those things, and yet communication and just being able to be open to different perspectives. And I speak to so many people, and it's always like, whether we're talking about culture and organizations or leadership or kind of anything with managing teams or relationships, it just comes down to our how to say, our need to be right sometimes, and to say, well, my team is the right team, we're the correct one, versus just coming to the conversation with the open mindset and to ask ourselves, like, what else could it be, right? Like, what else could it possibly be that this person is trying to portray that has nothing to do with me or my beliefs? And this person is not trying to attack me or, or disrespect me, but it's like, just trying to understand each other on a little bit deeper level. I always find it fascinating, right? That it's always a challenge.
Absolutely. And I think it ties back to what you were talking about before in terms of our innate tribalism, right? I think that cultural anthropologists and social scientists have been talking about this issue for many years, that, at the roots of humanity is, we started out as, tribal cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were cast out of a culture, it was so dangerous, right? And so we have this fundamental need for belonging that is really very tightly related to our physical survival, right? Which is also why, when we look at our brains, the structure of our brains and how our amygdalas work. So that's where our fight or flight kind of instincts are baked in, right? And when we engage in a conversation that has to do with our self-image, and that self-image is threatened, it activates the same spot in our brain that a physical danger does, because we know that if we are cast out of that tribe, it is so dangerous to us. And of course, in modern times, right, it doesn't represent the same danger, but we have the same brains, right? If I think a lot of people have seen the movie, the documentary, The Social Dilemma, on Netflix, right? Really interesting take on what social media has done to us. And there's this one quote that I always come back to that I think is fascinating from Jaron, who's basically a one of the founders of kind of the social media movement. And he says, we have Paleolithic brains, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. Right. And our brains and these institutions that we've built can't really keep up with the relentless pace of technological development. Right. And so now that we, of course, have AI, and that's become, a huge development within, the past year, that it's even more of a threat, because, those algorithms that target us and really surround us with our information bubbles are being supercharged. Right. And so it's so much more than our primitive brains can handle.
Yeah. And I wish more people understood that, because it is really just a response, and we have to be like, okay, wait a minute, like, let's take a step back, let's not just react, right? And just work with our brain to think something differently than what it's trying to respond with. So very interesting. So looking ahead, what are some, what do you envision for the efforts that you're working towards with organizations? What kind of impact are you looking to make, and how are you going to continue to do that?
Yeah, I really want to help organizations build those depolarizing cultures and do it for the long term, right? I think it's so important that we establish a lasting presence within organizations. In the corporate model, there are these employee resource groups that are fantastic ways to help employees feel like they're supported. Often they deal with folks' identities, right? There are LGBTQ groups, there are ethnic groups, there are groups for women, etc. But there aren't as much groups for people who want to do this kind of work. And I really think that fostering those kinds of groups within not just corporations, but also every type of organization that exists is going to be really important. And then linking those organizations, linking those subgroups within organizations is a really great way to help them feel supported and help them realize that these are absolutely common challenges that organizations around the country and around the world are dealing with, and make them feel like they're not so alone in that struggle, and that there's a lot of people who have a really strong interest in widening their perspectives, right? I mean, for me, it's been an incredible experience through my involvement with Braver Angels. So I left that organization in March of this year, and started DOC, Depolarizing Organizational Cultures. But the previous 6 years that I spent with that organization really expanded my network of folks to represent such a wide variety of perspectives. And I think that's done a lot for me in helping me to understand the the range of human experience and perspective, right? And so I think there's a lot of people that do appreciate that and they want to experience more of that. But within organizations that are narrowing, in their kind of political culture, their orthodoxy and their belief in what should be acceptable to say or talk about within organizations, right? People want an outlet for, just a genuine, curious exchange of experience and perspective.
Absolutely, absolutely. Before I ask you my last question for you, where can people get in touch with you if they're interested more to kind of work with you, or are you doing anything? I know you kind of do workshops and things like that for the public. Where can they best get in touch with you?
Yeah, so they can go to my website, which is depol.orgcultures.com. So DEPOL orgcultures.com. And they can click on the connect button there, and they can send me a message about what they're experiencing in their organizations. Or actually, right now, I just set up a mechanism for them to book a demo session. So they can do a half-hour demo where we'll take them through a set of skills and exercises that reinforce those skills. And they can see what these would look like within their organization, right? And how they can be customized for their specific sector or size of organization, things like that. So yeah, would love for people to book those demo sessions and to really experience what it's like to build these skills. One of the things that was really important, you and I talked about a demo session that I did last month, about a month ago. And coming out of that, one of the data points that I have been collecting about the experiences that people have in those sessions is the hope that people have that we can move forward as a country together. And the vast majority of the people came away from that session with more hope than they previously had, that we can actually move forward together, right? And that hope really helps to build the motivation, right? So I think that is so important, and that's what I want to foster within folks who are curious about what this work looks like.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I'll make sure to share all that in the show notes. So if anybody's listening, they're driving, they can't note it down, it's all going to be in the show notes in this episode. Last question I have for you is, what is one question you wish people would ask themselves more often?
Yeah, I mean, pretty simply, it's, could I be wrong? Right. And there's so many good articles and books written about this idea. One of my friends from Braver Angels, Monica Guzman, wrote a book called I Never Thought of It That Way. And I think it's a great encapsulation of this idea. And in my experience with that organization, it really reinforced the idea of intellectual humility, the absolute fact that our perspective is severely constricted, right? As a human being by nature, right? We can only really see what we see, right? And so I really hope that people are just fostering their curiosity about everyone around them and about the different experiences that we all have. And the fact is that people really see themselves as open-minded, and so, but sometimes they need to be reminded of that part of their self-image. So when people have asked me, what do you do when you encounter someone who is just so resistant to someone else's perspective? And I think it does come back to the idea that as human beings, we're inherently curious, and people like to see themselves that way. And if you remind them of that part of their self-image, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I am open to another perspective. I just wanted to make sure that you were clear on my perspective before we moved on, right? But if once you remind them of that, they'll be like, they tend to open themselves up to different perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. I think it's just more just also like creating that space for them, and that where they, I think it's just I do think inherently people are good and they mean well. I think it's just kind of being able to have those conversations in a safe setting and you know what I mean, like to be open with it. I think that's the key.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Very much on the nature of people. Like I see people as good, the people want to do good things, be good to their neighbors. And you know, sometimes we just have the wrong incentives assembled around us, and it makes it look like, you know, we are inherently bad. I just don't think that's the case.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the work that you're doing. I look forward to seeing more and more of that work, and I'm glad you're addressing a very much a challenging pain point for many organizations. So kudos to you, and thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been great.